Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long. All right, and with that, we bring in Matt Prehm of 247 Sports, of course, Duck Territory, covering the Oregon Ducks. You can hear him on the Autzen Audibles podcast. They just had Dan Lanning on the show, so if you want to go back and listen, subscribe, do whatever you want there. Matt, how's life?
Things are good. Spring is here, so it's craziness of weather. Kids are out of school right now, so interesting time in the Prehm household. But football is like 5 days away from being back, which is good.
Love to hear it. My first question's not even a question. It's vibes, are there? Which I guess is technically a question. But look, it's an Oregon program that seems to be heading in a good direction after signing day, after the first wave of portal signees. And even though the season sort of ended with the Washington and Oregon State disappointments for Oregon fans, what are the current vibes around the program heading into year two?
Yeah, there's vibes. There's good vibes. There's a lot of vibes with this program. Dan Lanning is a different coach than basically all his predecessors at Oregon. He's out in the public. He's involved in the community. Mario did a little bit of that. We would see Helfrich and Chip. Didn't see much time for Taggart to even have an opportunity to do that. He's at things that you just didn't see your head coach at. Like a week and a half ago, Lanning and his family, his three kids, and his wife are at the baseball stadium in the stands, just hanging out. Not a ceremonial first pitch, not part of some kind of promotion. That's why Mario would always be there. That's why you typically see head coaches. He's just there enjoying football or baseball. We've seen Dan talk about restaurants in town and publicly say, I go here. It's a different vibe, and then it's translated onto the football field, or I should say into the program as well. Like this unit is pretty close knit. They do these get real conversations. They have speakers come in, and it's an opportunity for the players to really hear their fellow teammates' upbringing, how they got to Eugene. They do a lot of fellowship type events. Dan had an example where one position group, they went out to breakfast, or all the position groups went out to breakfast. But this specific group, it was first guy to pick up their phone had to pay for the check for the entire position group. And it was to force them to kind of get to know each other. I think he's done a really good job, A, on the field, but B, just A, himself implementing himself into the community, and B, making sure his players know each other, who they are beyond football, and then also throwing them into the community, a lot of community service events as well. It's a different vibe with Oregon football lately.
So last year, a weird season, all things considered, right? They get demolished to open up the season in Atlanta at the hands of Georgia, Lanning's old team. They start cruising. Bo Nix looks pretty much excellent all year long until he gets beat up in that Washington game. That's a weird ending to that game, a disappointing one for Oregon fans, I'm sure. Certainly the way that the Oregon State game unfolded, but they finish on a high note, both with the bowl game and with recruiting. How is the 2022 year and period of time looked at internally right now from within the Oregon program?
I think right after the win over North Carolina in the Holiday Bowl, it was kind of like, hey, this is a great way to cap off a crappy finish. You lose 2 of your final 3 games, and all you need to do is win one of those, and you're in the Rose Bowl. Or because Utah would have made the pack, maybe the championship or the playoffs in that scenario. Now that it's been removed a little bit, I think you can look back at that season and say that was a good year, a good first year for a first year head coach with such a young staff. There were a lot of questions about how they would be able to perform on the field on Saturdays. They maybe unfairly got tagged with being a bunch of just good recruiters and recruiting guys. And they showed, that they're more than that. There was in-season adjustments. The bounce back from Georgia and to rattle off 8 straight wins is pretty darn impressive. I don't care if you play in a bad league or a good league. To win 8 straight after your first game of your head coaching career goes that way, where you're just destroyed. That's pretty impressive. And to get the guys to play like they did against North Carolina in the Holiday Bowl, when a lot of their starters were gone, a lot of their depth pieces had transferred out, or key guys at least. They found a way to win a game in a thrilling fashion. So I think removed from that, a couple months now, more than a couple months, but I think you can look at it as that was a good year. Were there things that needs to be improved? Absolutely. But, that kind of is a building block for year 2 now, where there's a lot of confidence. You've won 10 games. You won a bowl game. You've got your star quarterback back. You've got your star running backs back. Your star receiver is back. Your defense has some nice pieces that are returning, but the defense needs to be a lot better than what it was last year. And there's just that internal optimism now that things are going to take a big jump in year 2.
So the interesting thing to, I think, anybody who watched Oregon was Dan Lanning comes in after coaching an all-time excellent Georgia defense, and it's the Oregon defense that struggles. Brings in Bo Nix, obviously has the connection to now former offensive coordinator Kenny Dillingham from Auburn, and he's looked at as the wild card. Can he make it work after having such a turbulent career at Auburn? And it just sort of went against type. The defense struggles. Bo Nix largely excels.
Yep.
What is, in your mind, the next step for the defense? Was it a talent thing? Was it a coaching thing? Was it a just year 1 thing? And is there actually room to grow for Bo Nix now that he is in his second year and does have a new offensive coordinator?
There's a lot there. We'll start defensively.
Yeah.
They were atrocious in getting to the quarterback. Whether that was scheme, whether that was not having the players for the scheme, or maybe that was the players not understanding, how to execute the scheme. Probably it was all 3 of those. They were bad. The worst number from a sacks perspective this season since 1986. That's terrible. And you lose your leader in sacks, DJ Johnson. Mace Funa is back and is solid in that regard, but I don't think you can look at Mace Funa and say this is a guy that's going to go from 4 sacks to 15 sacks this coming year. They've added some pieces. Jordan Birch from South Carolina, former 5-star, is going to help address that. Justin Jacobs, a linebacker from Iowa that was really good a couple of years ago before he got hurt this past season. He's into the mix as well. They've added some recruits. You go look at their recruiting class, and it's like 11 guys play the defensive line position or edge spots. So they clearly knew they needed to upgrade there, needed to cycle in new faces, new bodies into that position group. That's going to be a big key for them is can they find and establish a consistent pass rush? Because if you can't get to the quarterback, especially in this league that they're going to be playing in next year, you're going to get roasted. I mean, the Pac-12 has been down in the last couple of seasons from a quarterback depth perspective. And in the final year of its current format of being 12 schools, it's going to have maybe the best collection of quarterbacks we've seen in a very long time. There's a lot of NFL quarterbacks there. You've got to be able to get to the quarterback because it doesn't matter how good your corners are, how good your safeties are. They're going to get roasted if they're going to have to cover for 5 seconds. That's the first issue. Linebackers were not good in 2022 as well, or 2023, 2022. What year is it? Do you guys know what year it is? Noah Sewell was a very dependable player, was on the field for every single game for Oregon, but it just never clicked for him in 2022. I don't know why. Dan Lanning was asked about it a bunch of times. He was, media was asked, PFF grades for Sewell aren't good, or his stats aren't near what they were in the last couple of seasons. And Dan's response every time would have been, well, we don't believe in stats. We just believe in production, and, Noah's doing a good job, but it just wasn't there. And something was off last season with him. He's now gone to the NFL. He's your most talented linebacker. Justin Flo never got going at Oregon. Immensely talented player. And this isn't just a Dan Lanning issue. This was something before him too. He became unplayable because he was so used to just being able to improvise and do whatever he wanted on the defensive field that he couldn't be trusted to actually perform what his position needed to do on the field. He became unplayable. Maybe things click for him at Arizona. It wouldn't surprise me if it does, and he has a really good career. But at Oregon, it just never clicked. Jeffrey Bossa was the other starting linebacker opposite Sewell, and a really standout freshman season in 2021 that saw him move from safety to linebacker to fill in because of depth. The expectation was this past year he'd make a big jump. That never really happened. He did play really, really well in that Holiday Bowl, though, when basically it was backs against the wall. You have to play good if Oregon's going to win, and he did. Maybe gives you a little optimism there. But linebacker play needs to be better as well. And then in the secondary, they've got holes. Christian Gonzalez is probably going to be a top 10 pick. He's gone. Bennett Williams at safety has graduated. He's gone. And then you look at your other options. Triquez Bridges and Dante Manning kind of shared that other starter spot at cornerback. Steve Stevens, Brian Addison, both safeties, both are back. Jamal Hill's a nickel back. Both they're all back as well. But they've gone into the portal. They've added corners. They've added safeties to the portal. They've hit the high school ranks for additions there as well. So they're banking on that group having to be better. So for defensively long, I guess the short-winded answer would be just there's a lot of work to be done here. There's a lot of optimism that work can be completed and they can make a big jump. But until you see it on the field, I don't think anyone reasonably can sit here and say that this defense is going to be elite in 2023. Could they get there? Sure. Yeah, but we'll need to see it. The Bo Nix one is an interesting question because we pondered this on the podcast on Odds and Audibles. Like, where's the room to grow for Bo Nix in his fifth season of college football?
Not getting hurt. Yeah.
And fifth different coordinator. And we realized he worked with Kenny Dillingham his freshman year at Auburn, but Gus Malzahn was the one that was calling plays. It wasn't Kenny. So this is going to be his fifth coordinator, and was last year kind of, all the stars aligning. He's playing above his average, and, not to change sports here, but Garrett Sim, college basketball at Oregon, his final season, one of Dana Altman's last years, he had like an insane senior year, played way above levels. And one of the assistant coaches at the time told me, like, we'd love to have Garrett back, but we don't think he could replicate what he did his senior year because it was so high above everything of what his normal career averages are like. Is that Bo Nix in 2023? I don't know, because he was so good. He avoided so many of the mistakes that plagued him during his college, his 3 seasons at Auburn. And what's the norm? The 1 year at Oregon or the 3 years at Auburn? Is it going to be somewhere in between, or is he surpassed what happened at Auburn, and what we get out of Bo Nix in 2023 is more of what happened in 2022? I don't know. I think that's one of the more fascinating questions for the offense. Is there's just this assumption that Oregon's offense is going to be elite in 2023 because Bo Nix is back, and did he just play out of his mind for 8 games and was really good, or is this really, did he make a big step jump? And we'll get that answer probably 2 or 3 games into the season.
Here's what I find interesting about this conversation, Matt. You cover the team far closer than Dan or I ever could. And yet we are talking about the Oregon 2022 season as if it's a pulsar we discovered in deep space and we're not sure how it works. Because Dan Lanning comes to Eugene on the heels of a historic defense at Georgia. I mean, truly historic defense. And as you both alluded, the defense at Oregon sort of bottomed out. In some ways more so than others. Why? We're not really sure. Then on the offensive side, I recall vividly when news broke that Bo Nix was going to transfer to Oregon, the cringe in my co-host's voice.
Yeah.
The cringe and the uncertainty about what that could mean in this new era, and Kenny Dillingham. There was a lot of uncertainty. And then we have the kind of season that we saw out of Bo Nix in the Heisman conversation. Up until about 3 weeks ago, I was saying he had 43 total touchdowns until somebody emailed in and said, dog, he had 44. He caught one. 44 touchdowns is a hell of a season. So on both sides of this thing, Matt, whether it's defense or offense, and this is by no means a slight against you because I think we feel similarly, we kind of don't know how either happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how much of an impact was Bo's success on familiarity with Kenny Dillingham, or to flip it, how much was Bo's success based on the fact that he played in front of a competent offensive line that knew how to pass block for the first time in his career? When and all those guys that were on last year's team, they're all basically gone now. They all graduated. They don't have any eligibility. So Oregon has Stephen Jones back. They've got a couple other linemen that play here and there, but what's the offensive line going to look like? Are they going to be as good or close to being as good protecting Bo Nix to give him that time and to give him, the ability to scan the defense and see the field? I don't know. I think so. And that's why I think this spring is so important for Oregon. I think it's why it's so important for the fans to kind of get a glimpse of what they're working with. And then, the month of September, with the schedule that they have, sets up for them to win some games. The at Texas Tech Week 2 game will be tough. Tyler Shuck versus Bo Nix, 2 Duck quarterbacks.
There you go.
Duck quarterback.
Look at that.
Yep.
I mean, that's going to be fascinating to see play out. But if they can get through that, it sets up where they can kind of get through some of these bumps in the road, and the offensive line can get up to speed. Maybe the defense finds their rhythm and gets into their spots, collectively as roles and what have you. That's why it's going to be so important for this staff, A, to put together a good game plan early so they don't slip up. All these games should be winnable in September. And then B, you've got to find ways to scheme your players into position and build that depth, because like you said, there are so many questions we just don't know about, and we're trying to validate, but at the same time, it was a one-off. And is 2022 a one-off, and in 2023 everyone reverts back to their means, or are we going to see some jumps here? That's one of the fascinating things with Oregon is talented roster, but they still have a lot of questions that they need to answer.
If we consider 2022 self-contained in its own vacuum, how do we grade out that job then that Dan Lanning did? Because some highs was a good season, a 9-win regular season, win the bowl game, 10-3 overall. Obviously, a lot of momentum on the recruiting game, but then you had some position groups, as you mentioned, on defense, others on offense, unexpected results across the board. You could argue A through F. How would you grade out Dan Lanning in year one?
Probably a B+. I think there were some costly coaching mistakes. There were some, lack of execution from the players' perspective late in the season that maybe hurt Oregon in that grade there a little bit. But Dan Lanning assumed a job that most first-time head coaches don't really ever assume, because normally when you arrive as a head coach somewhere, at the Power 5 level at least, you're more than likely going and replacing somebody who was failing the year before,
right,
or the years prior. And that wasn't the case. Oregon was in the Pac-12 championship game the year before that, 2 years before that, 3 years before that. They were in the Pac-12 championship game. Lanning stepped into a gig where the first year, the expectation was, fair or not, hey, dude, you got to get your team to the conference championship, and you have to win it. And so I think that has to be taken into consideration, because his predecessor, Mario, he showed up at Miami this past season, and there wasn't the expectation that they needed to win the league. And when that's there, and that expectation is hovering over your head, and you're a first-year head coach, that's tough. And especially, I thought Kirby Smart was, when they played week 1 and afterwards, Kirby had, came out and said that, Dan will never admit this publicly, but he knew we had better players. Like, that was a pretty telling statement. Kirby doesn't say that A, unless he believes it, which is true, which he should believe. But B, he also is not going to say that if he doesn't, if he doesn't know Dan well enough to know that Dan's thinking that. And Oregon didn't have, enough players that were, close to what Georgia had to even compete. So like the coaching job, there were highs. Winning 8 straight, especially after week 1 and how it happened, you have to praise that. That was a big answer. I think we learned more over those 8 weeks, maybe than we learned in a while, because around Oregon football, just because, Dan, Chip Kelly's first game at Boise State in 2009. I almost think Georgia was worse. And that Boise game included their star running back throwing a punch after the game was over. Mm-hmm. Chip lost control of the team week 1. So that has to be taken into consideration, that like the expectations at Oregon are different, when coaches leave, because they don't get fired. They take other head coaching jobs, which unfortunately for Oregon, it is what it is.
Yep.
Fair enough.
Matt, my beloved co-host, Dan Rubenstein, proud Oregon alum, initially was very salty about Mario Cristobal leaving. The salt, I feel at this point, is pretty much gone. However, it has marinated into more of a persistent snark, if you will.
A broth? Yeah.
With what you know now, like a year and a half later, I guess, how do you feel about the Cristobal era, looking back at Oregon, and now maybe contrasting that with what we see from Dan Lanning early on?
I think it's one of those where it's like, I think the Oregon fan base is probably, we love you, we thank you for what you did, but it's like a relative. You stayed a couple days and it's great, and you stay too long and all of a sudden things get weird. Mm-hmm. And that's just the vibe that removed with Mario Cristobal. He brought forth so many ideas and a lot of beliefs within the program that, hey, yes, we at Oregon, we can sign a top 10 recruiting class, and we can do it again, and we can compete for that. That mantra was not said inside inside that building, and it be a believable statement before Mario Cristobal. The commitment to building out the staff is a big thing that Mario Cristobal brought. We look at this like a couple months ago on the podcast that Oregon staff like 10 years ago was like 14 people on the official website that Oregon has. And today it's over 40. The number is just grown exponentially, and that's because of Mario Cristobal. But the Cristobal era also saw him micromanage everything, and he had to have a hand in everything. He couldn't delegate and allow other people to do their jobs without the fear of him overlooking. The biggest, I guess, story I've ever had was I was communicated to me that, at Oregon, like, he had final approval of every graphic that got sent out on the socials. And there would be calls at like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning from Mario Cristobal because he's working, and this isn't good enough. We need to change here. We need to change there. And it just got to the point where it was like, we love you, but man, this is too much. Like, you need to let your guys do your jobs. And so I think at Oregon, there's definitely a sense of you're thankful for the years that you had him, but you've also got a guy now in place, and Dan Lanning, who's more in balance, more in tune from a workflow, from a commitment standpoint with what the Oregon is and should be.
What do they say? Don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened. One of those deals.
Yeah.
Yes, that is exactly the Mario Cristobal era at Oregon.
Gotcha.
That's a perfect way to say it.
So now externally, Mario Cristobal recruits crazy well. Chip Kelly had good but not great classes, top 15 type classes. Dan Lanning finished extremely strong, punctuated by that picture of him, smoking the cigar on signing day, the early signing day. What is the viewpoint on Dan Lanning and his staff nationally, regionally? How does that differ from previous coaches at Oregon? Is there a difference in strategy? Is there a difference in relationship building? How is Lanning and his staff, how are they viewed at high schools and by 7-on-7 teams and, whatever else is out there organizing recruits? Sure. What is their general reputation, and perhaps how does that differ?
It's high. It's very high. I would compare it to being similar to Mario Cristobal's reputation, being an avid recruiter. Dan Lanning is involved in a lot of these recruitments, especially the big, the high guys. Their strategies are the same. Mario basically said, we're going to have staff turnover. I don't want one coach being in charge of one recruit. The whole staff is involved. Lanning does the same thing there. We've also seen the importance of getting prospects to Eugene unofficially for visits, really pushing that. I think Mario did a really good job, and Lanning built upon that and expanded it more. There were like 6 or 7 5-star recruits that rolled through Eugene during the month of January, this past January. And I can't recall that many guys from an underclassman standpoint rolling through Eugene before. It was pretty surreal to see his ability and his staff's ability to get guys here and then do it consistently, do it over and over again. Because it's one thing when you coach at Georgia and you've got 15 5-stars over 3 recruiting classes that are all 4-hour, 5-hour drives. It's easy to, over a 4 or 5 month span to talk to those parents, say, hey, make the drive over, spend the afternoon here, spend the night, check us out in the morning, and then go home. A quick 1-day trip. You can't do that in Eugene. I mean, you've got a couple 3-stars, a couple 4-stars, and maybe your occasional 5 that's in the Pacific Northwest. So his staff's ability to get kids here, whether it's from Arizona, they hit Arizona really hard. And when Dillingham left, there was definitely that feeling of, oh, maybe these guys are going to see a little dip in activity in the state of Arizona now. Like their offers are still out there strong. They're still getting guys to come up for official visits. They've got a verbal commitment already in 2024 from an Arizona prospect. There's a couple more that they look really good for. So they're making inroads there that, beyond Kenny Dillingham. They still recruit the Southeast. They still recruit the state of Florida. Santana Moss, a kid from Florida in the 2025 class, is committed to Oregon. He was here this past weekend for an unofficial visit. He's been committed for a couple weeks now. So they're still recruiting at a national level. They're still recruiting Southern California really well, like Mario Cristobal did. And I just think the best way to expand on it is he's just built off of what was in place, the infrastructure that was in place here. He kept Don Johnson, one of the directors, player and personnel at Oregon under Mario. That was one of his first things that he did. He kept him on staff and didn't let him go to Miami or anyone else. He upped the contract, gave him a long-term deal. Marshall Malkow's chief of staff, I should say. He's been instrumental. So it's basically building upon the infrastructure and expanding it out and just making it even better. Now, is his ability to finish like Mario has the last couple of cycles at Oregon? He always would have a big bang on signing day. We thought it was going to be like that this past year with Bowen and a couple other guys that they were involved in, Hicks. But we'll see. It's one full year through the cycle. This year they're off to a good start. It's not the greatest. It's certainly could be a lot worse too. And I imagine here in about 6 weeks we'll have a better idea of where the class's potential could be at.
Perhaps more than other schools, there is money looming over Oregon's program, and with money comes influence, comes opinions. What is the opinion of the current state of Oregon football from, I say in a shadowy way, the money, right? Whether it's Phil Knight, whether it's the Pape family, whether it's whoever, Pat Kilkenny, Dan Lanning, inexperienced as a head coach. Mario Cristobal has the experience, comes from a big program. Of course, Willie Taggart has head coaching experience, had West Coast experience. Chip Kelly had experience within the program before taking over as head coach. Mark Helfrich has experience within the program before taking over. Dan Lanning had no connection. So is the money, are they squarely in the corner of Dan Lanning and the direction of the program? Are they happy? Are they thrilled? What is the opinion behind the scenes of where this program is?
There's very little pressure on Dan Lanning to be, there's pressure, yes, but he's not having to go and win over their approval.
Right.
The big boosters at Oregon love Dan Lanning. And in large part, the success on the field, that's always going to be important and probably the most important thing. But what I went back to at the very beginning of the vibes, like, this dude's just a different cat. He's my age. I'm assuming he's close to all three of us.
I'm a very, very young guy.
Oh,
but continue.
Stop it.
I'm in my mid to late 30s for
very
another
late
like
30s.
4 months.
Continue.
But he's just a different dude, and he's cool. He's a guy that golfs. He goes to sporting events. He's out exploring the state of Oregon. He's made it a point to really entrench himself into the community. And to go back on that and touch on something, when he first arrived, he called Kid Sports. It's an organization in Eugene. Dan may be aware of it, but they basically run the biggest youth leagues, in town for Eugene, Springfield, and the surrounding communities of the area. Whether it's football, basketball, lacrosse, baseball, whatever. They run all these leagues. And he called them and said, I want all your kids, I want all their families to come watch a spring football practice on behalf of Oregon. We're going to give you guys a full tour of the facility, yada, yada. Your kids look up to my players as role models. It's our opportunity to, introduce our guys to you. And they called back and said, we'd love to do it. What do you need from us? And he said nothing. And the person in charge is Bev Smith. She said, you realize that's like thousands of people that you're inviting and you don't need anything from us? And he said, nope, we'll provide drinks. We'll provide pizza. We'll provide snacks. We'll have enough people in here to give everyone a tour to make sure that everyone feels personable. And then they did that. They brought him out to the football field. They watched practice. It was a warm day that day. I was there for practice. And Dan Lanning was the first one to rush over to the gate that basically separated the fans and the players on the practice field, and tore down the gate and yelled at all the kids, get on the football field, play with my kids. And that is why I think all of the big money people at Oregon are all in on Dan, because he's truly made it a point at a school where they've seen Chip Kelly go to the NFL. They've had to fire Mark Helfrich, who was an in-state guy. They saw Willie Taggart leave within a year. And then Mario Cristobal, year after year, demanding more, saying he's committed to Oregon, eventually leaving to go cross-country to go home. There's now a guy in place who's like legitimately going out of his way to make it clear that his family is enriched into the community. He's all in on the community. He's all in on Oregon. And I that goes a long ways. And I would be utterly shocked if I bumped into anyone that was a big money player from a booster perspective at Oregon that was upset at Dan Lanning's first season.
The big story these past couple off seasons, and all of what you're saying resonates with me, but the big story over these past couple off seasons has been the shadow over schools not moving to the Big Ten, not moving to the SEC, and not playing on what is perceived to be the biggest stages, and rightfully so, within the sport. Oregon's a major program. They've played for national championships. They have a Heisman winner in the last decade. They spend a lot of money. They've got the Nike branding. Everything is there for Oregon as a national program. And yet there is I think a shadow of uncertainty over the program and the program's future, just in terms of where they play, not that if they'll play. Is any of that internal? Is any of that something that's discussed within the program as for we're doing everything we can, but now we are being perceived to be in a disadvantaged place because the heavyweight programs or the heavyweight city within the conference is moving on? Is that something that lingers within the program at all?
I think there's definitely like an acknowledgement of that happening a little bit, that USC, UCLA are leaving, and the conference is going to take a dip again from a strength standpoint nationally. But I think Oregon is in a unique position where they know they've got the boosters where the money gap, and it's going to be ginormous. It's going to be a gap bigger than the Grand Canyon from a money standpoint that the Big Ten schools, the SEC schools are getting, and what will be the Pac-10 schools. Maybe they expand to 12 again. Maybe they expand to 14. Who knows? But the money gap is going to be big between those two, the haves and the have-nots, you could say. But I think at Oregon, at least internally, from the money, there's always that idea that the money can step in and fill the gap. And at least from a short-term perspective, I think there's a lot of people at Oregon that say, why can't we just become Clemson of the West? Why can't we just, if the playoff is expanding and all we need to do is win the league, yes, having more money from the money rights deals is going to be huge. It's eventually going to catch up to Oregon and hurt them. But from a short-term perspective, and short-term could be 5-10 years, I don't know. But from a short-term perspective, why can't they be the Clemson of the West and basically dominate the West Coast and dominate whatever is left of what the Pac-12 will be? And every year or majority of the years, get into the playoff as whatever seed, because you're the representative of the Pac-X conference. Why can't they do that? I think that's the big notion right now is you take out USC, you take out UCLA, and from a brand perspective, from an on-field perspective, there really is no challenger to Oregon that's left. There's schools that maybe have one side of it. Like Utah certainly is more consistent or as consistent as Oregon from a winning on the field perspective, but they will come nowhere close from a brand perspective and a recruiting scope and just national reach that Oregon has. Washington is kind of in both categories, but they're still, below what Oregon is right now. So I think that's kind of where the Ducks sit, is that there's really no true equal or school that's even better like a USC in those regards than Oregon. And you have to see at least where it goes. And you just would think that in 5, 10, 15 years, whenever college football or college athletics finds its final shape, that Oregon will be included, which they should be.
Matt, you mentioned that Dan Lanning, in a sense, is just like us. He likes to golf. Yeah. He likes to do normal people things. What does Dan Lanning shoot at Bandon Dunes?
It's a good question. I have it on good authority that he played a local course in Eugene and was not very good.
Really?
So he's probably truly one of us.
Yeah.
And why should he be like an elite golfer?
It'd be weird if he were terrific on the course.
Yeah. Dan Lanning's a scratch golfer. There's probably a deeper issue here with respect to Oregon football.
Yeah. But Bandon Dudes, I would say something under 100.
That'd be respectable.
That's respectable.
Course. Yeah. He was. I've been told he frequents a golf course in the Eugene area, and some days he looks good, some days he looks really bad, like one of us. So
been there. All right. Matt Prehm of Duck Territory, 247 Sports, and the Autzen Audibles podcast. The vibes are strong on the show. The vibes are strong within the Oregon Ducks program. Matt, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.